By 1886, America was cutting and shipping 25 million tons of ice annually. Not steel, not coal, ice. Frozen water ranked as the nation's second largest export, behind only cotton. To put that in perspective, that same year only 6.4 million tons of iron and 2.9 million tons of steel were produced. An industry that employed 90,000 workers and 25,000 horses moved frozen blocks from New England ponds to Calcutta dining rooms. An industry built on a product that cost nothing to manufacture and melted the moment summer arrived. The conventional story says American wealth came from manufacturing, from factories, from the railroads that stitched the continent together. That story is incomplete. Before refrigeration, before electricity, before the 20th century changed everything, a Boston merchant proved you could sell winter itself. His name was Frederick Tudor. They called him the Ice King. And the empire he built from frozen ponds would transform how humanity ate, drank, and preserved life itself. The evidence sits in shipping manifests, court records, newspaper archives, and a silver cup presented in Calcutta on November 22, 1833. Here is what actually happened. Enjoy our walk in the park video while listening to facts about Wild West. February 10th, 1806. Gray's Wharf, Charlestown, Massachusetts. Temperature, below freezing. A 23-year-old man who refused Harvard stands on the dock watching workers load 130 tons of frozen blocks onto the Brigantine Favourite. Each block weighs roughly 300 pounds, cut by hand from a pond on his father's farm in Saugus. The men use saws, axes and iron tongs. The blocks are packed in hay, stacked tight against wooden supports, bound for Martinique in the French West Indies, 1,500 miles south across waters that never freeze. Frederick Tudor is the third son of William Tudor, a wealthy Boston lawyer who served as legal advisor to George Washington during the Revolution. His older brother William will become a literary figure, help found the Boston Athenaeum. Frederick spurned education at 13 to work on the docks. He has seen wealthy families enjoying ice cream and cold drinks from ice harvested each winter and stored in ice houses. He has calculated that people who have never experienced cold might pay fortunes for it. The Boston Gazette runs a notice that captures the city's mood. No joke, a vessel with a cargo of ice has cleared out from this port for Martinique. We hope this will not prove a slippery speculation. Everyone in Boston knows this venture is madness. Who ships something that melts? Who bets a fortune on selling frozen water to people who have never seen ice form naturally? The voyage will take 3 weeks through increasingly warm waters. There are no ice houses in the Caribbean, no infrastructure, no understanding of refrigeration. Frederick Tudor stands on that wharf anyway and watches his frozen cargo disappear over the horizon. His brother William has sailed ahead to find buyers and secure storage. Most of the cargo will survive the journey, none of it will sell. When Frederick arrives in Martinique, he discovers William has found neither buyers nor storage. Local residents stare at the translucent blocks like visitors from another world. Tudor suggests they wrap the ice in blankets and take it home. They have no blankets thick enough. They have never needed them. He loses $4,500 on the venture. He will spend the next decade learning why. The economics of Tudor's failure contain the seeds of his eventual fortune, and understanding those economics requires understanding how ice works. Ice was free. It formed every winter on thousands of New England ponds, lakes and rivers without any human intervention. Cutting it required only labour and simple tools. Sawdust, the waste product of lumber mills scattered across New England's forests, insulated ice better than straw, hay, or any other material then available. Mill owners gave sawdust away because it was garbage to them. Ships leaving Boston for the Caribbean sailed south empty to collect sugar, rum, coffee, and tropical fruit. Tudor's ice filled those empty holds at rock-bottom freight rates because captains preferred any cargo to none. The product cost nothing. The insulation cost nothing. The shipping cost almost nothing. The only obstacle was melting. If Tudor could reduce melt loss during transport and storage, the mathematics of ice transformed from impossible to inevitable. He experimented relentlessly. Double-walled ice houses with sawdust packed between the walls, ice blocks cut thicker, 16 to 18 inches minimum, because larger blocks retained cold longer, tighter stacking so blocks formed continuous masses rather than individual units exposed to warm air, wooden platforms to keep ice off earthen floors, drainage channels to remove meltwater before it warmed surrounding blocks. By 1815, he had borrowed $2,100, built an ice house in Havana with walls 25 feet square on the exterior, 19 feet square on the interior, and 16 feet high, capable of holding 150 tons. Boston sheriffs chased him to the wharf over unpaid debts. He sailed anyway. By 1816, he was finally turning a profit on regular shipments to Cuba. His gross sales that year reached nearly $9,000, though dishonest agents stole much of it. He expanded to Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans. He gave bartenders free ice for a year and taught them to make cold drinks. He built demonstration programs showing how iceboxes could preserve food. He was building demand for a product people had never known they needed. In 1825, a 23-year-old named Nathaniel Wyeth worked as foreman at Fresh Pond in Cambridge, cutting ice for Tudor's growing company. Wyeth came from a family that owned a hotel near Fresh Pond. He was intelligent, ambitious, and frustrated by the brutal inefficiency of hand-cutting ice. The work was dangerous beyond anything modern workers can easily imagine. Men walked onto frozen ponds in temperatures that reached 30 below zero. They carved blocks using saws, picks, and tongs with no mechanization. Each block weighed between 200 and 400 pounds. Workers fell through thin ice and drowned, swept under by currents before anyone could reach them. Massive blocks slipped from tongs and crushed hands, feet, legs. Frostbite was constant. Men worked dawn to dusk during cold snaps because the harvest window was unpredictable. The process was slow, expensive, and lethal. Wyeth invented a horse-drawn ice plough with twin metal blades set approximately 30 inches apart. Horses dragged the plough across frozen ponds in straight lines, scoring parallel grooves perhaps 2 inches deep on the first pass. Subsequent passes with longer-toothed ploughs cut deeper grooves, 8 to 10 inches, eventually 12. The ice fractured along those clean lines into uniform blocks approximately 2 feet square. One horse-drawn plough accomplished the work of a dozen men with hand saws. The blocks were uniform, making them easier to stack, store, and ship. The invention dropped harvesting costs from 30 cents per ton to 10 cents per ton. An ice trade historian named Cummings documented this transformation. Tudor hired Wyeth immediately at $1,200 annual salary and took over management of the Fresh Pond operation. Wyeth also designed above-ground ice houses with double walls and sawdust insulation between them, replacing the underground ice cellars that had been used for centuries. He invented a pulley system where one platform lifted ice blocks, while a counterweighted platform simultaneously lowered for the next load. Production tripled virtually overnight. Tudor's ice empire was no longer a curiosity run by an eccentric. It was becoming the foundation of an industry. Samuel Austin was a Boston silk and spice merchant whose ships sailed regularly around the Cape of Good Hope to British India. In early 1833, Austin approached Tudor with a proposition that seemed impossible, even by Tudor's standards. Austin's ships travelled 16,000 miles to Calcutta, a journey of approximately 4 months each way, and returned loaded with silks, spices, and goods for the American market. They sailed south empty. What if those empty holds carried ice? Tudor had been dreaming about India for 20 years. His diaries, preserved at Harvard's Baker Library, show that Calcutta was always the ultimate destination in his imagination. But the voyage seemed beyond any reasonable hope. 4 months through tropical waters, crossing the equator twice, temperatures that would melt ice in hours without extraordinary protection. On April 12, 1833, Tudor recorded in his diary that Austin had approached him about the shipment. They reached terms rapidly. By April 29th, Tudor supervised the fitting of the brig Tuscany at Tudor Wharf in Charlestown. Workers packed 180 tons of ice into the hold, using techniques Tudor had refined over 27 years. The ice was layered in sawdust, sealed between double-planked containers with air gaps for additional insulation, positioned so that the cargo remained accessible only from the roof where temperatures were coolest. Tudor's diary entry from May 12, 1833 reads, "Sailed this day the ship Tuscany Captain Littlefield for Calcutta with 180 tons of ice, an experiment I have been desirous of making for 20 years. Captain Clement Littlefield later compiled an abstract of his voyages and noted that this cargo was the first ice that ever crossed the equator. The Tuscany sailed southwest to catch favourable winds, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and turned northeast into the Indian Ocean. The voyage lasted 4 months and 7 days. When the Tuscany approached the Ganges Delta in early September 1833, many people in Calcutta believed reports of an American ship carrying frozen water were an elaborate hoax. British colonials suffering through Indian summers had encountered only Hooghly slush, named for the Hooghly River near Calcutta. This was a thin film of ice scraped from the tops of buried clay pots filled with boiled water, laid out on straw beds during winter nights, when temperatures occasionally dropped enough for surface ice to form. The resulting product resembled grey snow more than actual ice, was often contaminated with dirt, and was expensive even at that quality. The Tuscany's hold contained something entirely different. 100 tons of crystal-clear New England ice remained solid after 16,000 miles. 80 tons had melted during the voyage, but fully 100 tons survived. Packed tight in sawdust, cold to the touch, transparent as glass. The ship could not unload until customs formalities completed. The ice finally came ashore after sunset on September 13th, 1833. Crowds gathered at the docks. Contemporary accounts describe residents touching the ice and screaming that they had been burned. Their hands blistered from cold they had never experienced. One person reportedly asked whether ice grew on trees in America. Others, alarmed that their purchases were shrinking in the heat, demanded refunds. J. H. Stockler, editor of the Englishman newspaper, received a servant's excited news while in bed and sent the servant to bring back a sample. The servant neglected to insulate the ice during the journey home and returned with a sliver the size of a fingernail. But enough ice survived for the venture to become an immediate commercial sensation. Tudor sold his ice at 3 halfpence per pound, cheap enough to undercut the Hooghly slush and still profit enormously. The difference in quality was unmistakable. Word spread rapidly across British India. Within weeks, British merchants in Bombay raised funds to build an ice house at the docks. Tudor secured monopoly contracts for ice imports to Calcutta, negotiating favourable terms from colonial administrators, grateful for the service. He expanded to Bombay, then Madras. He built ice houses in all 3 cities. The Madras structure, designed by British military engineer Colonel J.J. Collingwood, became an engineering marvel. Collingwood borrowed a Syrian roofing technique using a double-domed structure built from clay cylinders that provided exceptional insulation. That ice house later became a museum dedicated to Swami Vivekananda, who stayed there in 1897. Over the next 20 years, Tudor's Calcutta operations alone generated an estimated $220,000 in profits. He introduced ice cream to British India. He trained bartenders to make cold drinks. The gin and tonic became a symbol of British colonial power, partly because Tudor made the ice that chilled it reliably available. The mathematics that made Tudor rich created an entire industry across 2 continents. By the 1850s, ice was shipped from Boston to 43 countries spanning 6 continents. In 1847 alone, 353 ice-laden vessels departed Boston Harbour for destinations including Rio de Janeiro, Hong Kong, Singapore, Rangoon, Sydney, and ports throughout South America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Boston shipped approximately 75,000 tons that year, while consuming another 27,000 tons locally. The Hudson River Valley between Poughkeepsie and Albany became the centre of domestic ice production for the eastern United States, with 135 massive warehouses lining the banks by the 1880s. Each warehouse could hold 50,000 to 250,000 tons. 20,000 workers harvested ice from the Hudson each winter, earning approximately $1 per day, with an additional $2 for those who brought horses. The Kennebec River in Maine emerged as the industry's quality leader, and the backup supply when Hudson harvests failed. Maine's deep lakes, cold winters, and location close to Atlantic shipping lanes produced crystal blue ice that set the national standard for purity. Between 1844 and the early 1850s, ice from Wenham Lake in Massachusetts became so fashionable among British aristocracy that Norwegian competitors actually renamed Lake Oppegard as Wenham Lake to compete in London markets. That level of brand recognition for frozen pond water seems absurd today. It made perfect sense when ice was luxury and scarcity drove prices. At the industry's peak between 1870 and 1890, approximately 25,000 men converged on Maine's ice fields each winter to cut and store ice. Contemporary accounts indicate that Maine ice revenue during these decades exceeded California's annual gold production. James L. Cheeseman moved his ice business from the Hudson to Maine during the 1860 ice famine, bringing modern techniques and building 12 ice houses near Pittston. By 1869, he controlled some 60 companies along the Kennebec. The Knickerbocker Company, his successor, controlled about a third of Kennebec production by 1890. Charles Morse of Bath consolidated the entire northeastern ice business in 1891, becoming the second man to earn the title Ice King. The work remained extraordinarily dangerous despite mechanization. Men walked onto frozen ponds in sub-zero temperatures, exposed to winds that cut through clothing like blades. They fell through thin ice and drowned, swept under by currents before rescue was possible. Horses and wagons broke through unexpectedly and were sometimes never recovered, the animals dragging their drivers down with them. 400-pound blocks slipping from conveyor machinery crushed workers positioned below. One documented case from the Des Moines River in Iowa involved an ice cutter who drowned while harvesting for the Ottawa Sand Company. The company was ordered to pay his widow $15 per week for 300 weeks. The man had earned $4.50 per day while alive. That was good money for seasonal work. It came with seasonal risk. Newspapers regularly reported drownings, amputations, crushed limbs, and deaths from hypothermia. Many workers carried 10-foot poles so that if the ice broke beneath them, the pole would span the hole and allow them to hold on until rescue arrived. The harvest ran day and night during cold snaps because no one knew when temperatures would rise. Ice transformed American eating, drinking, and commerce in ways that remain embedded in modern infrastructure. Refrigerator cars packed with natural ice began carrying dressed beef from Chicago slaughterhouses to eastern markets during the 1870s. Previously, cattle were shipped to live by rail, losing weight during transport, requiring feeding and watering at stations along the route. Dressed beef, slaughtered in Chicago and shipped cold, arrived fresher, weighed more and cost less. Gustavus Swift, founder of Swift & Company, hired engineer Andrew Chase in 1878 to design an ice-cooled railroad car that actually worked. Chase positioned ice compartments at the top of the car, allowing cold air to flow naturally downward over tightly packed meat stored at the bottom, keeping the center of gravity low and preventing cargo from shifting during transport. When major railroads refused to haul Swift's cars, fearing damage to their investments in stock cars, cattle pens, and livestock feeding stations, Swift contracted with the Grand Trunk Railway to ship through Canada. By 1880, Swift's refrigerator line operated nearly 200 cars, shipping an average of 3,000 beef carcasses weekly to Boston alone. Armour, Hammond, Morris, and other Chicago meatpackers followed immediately. By 1920, the Swift refrigerator line alone operated 7,000 ice-cooled cars. A chain of icing stations emerged across the continent at Chicago, Omaha, Utah, and the Sierra Nevada, allowing refrigerator cars to cross from coast to coast with fresh cargo. Chilled salmon from Oregon reached New York tables. Fresh California vegetables arrived in Boston markets. Midwestern butter was shipped to New York, then across the Atlantic to Britain, where by the 1870s 15% of British butter consumption came from American dairy farms. Ice enabled Chicago to become the center of American meat processing. The Union Stockyards opened Christmas Day 1865, eventually encompassing 475 acres with 50 miles of roads and 130 miles of railroad track. By the 1860s, two-thirds of households in Boston and New York received daily ice deliveries. Iceboxes became standard fixtures in middle-class homes. The winter of 1889 to 1890 was one of the warmest on record. The Hudson River never froze thick enough to harvest safely. The New York Times declared an ice famine. New York City, consuming approximately 3 million tons annually by then, faced summer without reliable supply. Prices that normally ran $5 to $7 per ton jumped to $10 in New York and $20 in Cincinnati. In the South, where mechanical ice plants were already operating, prices remained stable at $5 to $7. Entrepreneurs raced to Maine, where the Kennebec had frozen properly. Speculators invested fortunes in emergency harvesting operations, but nature delivered a second blow. The following summer turned unseasonably cool. Demand collapsed. Investors who had stockpiled ice at inflated prices were ruined. The ice famine of 1890 revealed the industry's fatal vulnerability. The entire supply chain depended on weather that could not be predicted or controlled. Mechanical ice manufacturing had existed since the 1850s, when Dr. John Gorrie of Florida patented an ice-making machine designed to cool yellow fever patients. The technology was unreliable, expensive, and produced ice of inferior quality during its early decades. But steady improvements made artificial ice competitive by the 1880s. Plants appeared first in Australia and India, where natural ice imports were most expensive. They spread to Brazil, the American South, and eventually challenged natural ice even in northern markets. By 1889, 222 mechanical ice plants operated in the United States, primarily in southern states. Urban consumers increasingly worried about pollution in natural ice harvested from rivers that also received industrial and human waste. Typhoid outbreaks were traced to contaminated ice. Artificial ice, manufactured from purified water, seemed safer even when it cost more. Frederick Tudor died on February 6, 1864, at his home in Boston, on the corner of Beacon and Joy Streets. He was 80 years old. His fortune was estimated at $12 million, equivalent to approximately $200 million today. He had spent much of his later years at his estate in Nahant, Massachusetts, where he had planted thousands of trees to beautify the barren peninsula. His great-granddaughter Tasha Tudor would become a celebrated children's book illustrator. He did not live to see mechanical refrigeration destroy the industry he created. His ice business continued under family management into the 1880s. But the warning signs were visible before his death. His India trade collapsed after local ice plants undercut imported ice. The future belonged to machines, not frozen ponds. The ice trade lasted barely a century from rise to collapse. It emerged from Frederick Tudor's first disastrous voyage in February 1806 and peaked during the 1880s with 25 million tons harvested annually. It declined through the 1890s as mechanical refrigeration spread and pollution concerns increased. The 1880 Census Special Report on the Ice Trade provides a snapshot of the industry at its height. Chicago consumed between 575,000 and 900,000 tons annually, depending on weather and prices, with meatpackers and breweries together accounting for approximately 350,000 tons. 875 men were employed delivering ice in Chicago alone. February 1919 marked the last commercial ice harvest on the Kennebec River in Maine. Northern farmers continued cutting ice for local use until rural electrification brought refrigerators to remote farmhouses during the 1930s and 1940s. By 1914, the balance had already shifted. America produced 24 million tons of manufactured ice alongside 26 million tons of natural ice. The machines had caught up. At its peak, the American ice industry employed 90,000 people and was capitalized at $28 million, equivalent to approximately $660 million today. It transformed the American diet by enabling refrigerated transport of meat, dairy, vegetables, and fruit across continental distances. It created the infrastructure that became the modern cold chain. It demonstrated that logistics and insulation could transform a worthless natural phenomenon into a global commodity. Today, almost nothing physical remains. The 135 massive warehouses along the Hudson burned, collapsed, or were demolished decades ago. The Kennebec River ice fields reverted to quiet forest. Tudor's ice houses in Calcutta and Bombay were converted or destroyed. Only the Madras Ice House survives as Vivekananda House, a museum dedicated to the philosopher who stayed there briefly in 1897, with no mention of its origins in frozen Massachusetts ponds. Researchers studying Walden Pond have documented that it now freezes 2 weeks later than in Thoreau's time and remains frozen for shorter periods. The warm winters that occasionally devastated 19th century ice harvests have become increasingly common in the 21st century. In September 1833, the brig Tuscany carried 180 tons of Massachusetts ice across the equator to Calcutta. 80 tons melted during the 4-month voyage through tropical waters. 100 tons survived. A silver-gilt presentation cup was given to William Rogers, the ice agent aboard, inscribed with gratitude for the spirit and enterprise which projected and successfully executed the first attempt to import a cargo of American ice into Calcutta. November 22, 1833. That cup sits today in the Peabody Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. The ice houses are gone. The warehouses collapsed. The workers lie in forgotten graves. The 25 million tons cut annually dissolved into water and evaporated into memory. What remains is invisible but everywhere. The refrigerated supply chain that feeds modern civilization, the cold storage systems that make global food distribution possible, the assumption embedded in every American kitchen that preservation is ordinary and ice is free. Frederick Tudor spent 20 years in failure, in debt, in prison. He shipped a product that melted to customers who had never wanted it, across distances that seemed impossible. He died worth a fortune. History remembered the railroad barons, the oil magnates, the steel titans. It forgot that America's second largest export was frozen water, and that an industry built on selling winter itself transformed how humanity eats.